Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Elsa Putri Ramadhina. I'm from class B. So now I want to do a video review about the history of the English literature. So the first period is the Old English period, the timeline of the era. Old English or Anglo-Saxon is the beginning of the stories of literature in Great Britain. Since the Romans occupied Britain, literature has been part of the oral tradition and has rarely been written. Old English, or the earliest form of the English language, it was spoken and written in Anglo-Saxon Britain from century 450 Common Era up to century 1150. It therefore continued to be used for a few decades after the Norman conquest of 1066, according to the Dictionary of Old English Corpus at the University of Toronto. The body of existing Old English material from 600 to 1150 consists of only 3,037 texts, excluding manuscripts with minor variations. In example, only 3 million words. The characteristic of the era. 4 dialects of Old English are known: Northumbrian in northern England and southeastern Scotland, Mercian in central England, Kentish in southeast England, and West Saxon is in south and southwest England. Mercian and Northumbrian are often classified as Anglican dialects. Some extant Old English writings in the West Saxon dialect. The first major period of literary activity occurred during the reign of King Alfred and the Great in the 9th century. Old English has 3 genders: masculine, feminine, and neutral in nouns and adjectives, and nouns and pronouns and adjectives are in fact 4 cases. Old English has a greater proportion of strong verbs, sometimes called irregular verbs, in contemporary grammar than modern English. The major author and the works in this era. In this era, many literary works have been written anonymously, or nobody is aware of who the writer is. However, there have been writers who have been dominant inside the Anglo-Saxon era: Caedmon and Alfred the Great. Caedmon changed into an Anglo-Saxon poet called the Daddy of Vintage English. He commissioned several more translations of history, geography, and even of Caedmon's Hymen into West Saxon, which became the dominant language in the 10th and 11th centuries. And the second one, Richard Alfred the Great, changed into a king of the Anglo-Saxon who supported the Anglo-Saxon chronicle describing the life, history, and language of this era. He changed into a king of the West Saxon on the case of the 9th century, changed into called the translator of Cura Pastoralis, a manual to residing and religious education. The first poem of literature is called Caedmon's Hymen. It dates from the overdue 7th century, around 670. His hymen is consequently the primary text of reward in English culture and the primary Christian spiritual poem in English, even though many Latin hymens have been acknowledged on the time. And the second one, fundamental poem of Old English, is Beowulf. Beowulf changed into written set in the 6th and 8th centuries through an unknown writer. It changed into the best acknowledged lengthy textual content of Old English, the epic poem and alliterative verse. The next is medieval era. Timeline of the era. The Middle Age or medieval era in Europe was a long historical period of 500 Anno Domini to 1500 Anno Domini. It's been 1000 years. It covers the period from the fall of the Roman Empire to the rise of the Ottoman Empire. Castles and prisons, guilds and monasteries, cathedrals and crusades. Characteristics of the era. Medieval literature is all the written manifestation that took place in the Middle Age, which began after the fall of the Roman Empire until the beginning of the Renaissance. The place where literature developed was the European continent. It was characterized by the generation of works, for the most part by unknown authors, which dealt with subjects related to morality and religion, stories of chivalry, religious texts, among others. It was first written in Latin and later in the national language of some countries. Major authors and works of the era. There are several major authors and works in this era, and I will mention two of them. First is Geoffrey Chaucer, 343 until 400. The major works of him are the Book of the Duchess, the House of Fame, Annelida and Arcite, the Parliament of Fools, Troilus and Cresside, and the Legend of Good Woman and the Canterbury Tales. The next is Marjorie Kempe. Marjorie Kempe was a medieval mystic and writer of the primary autobiography in English. The Book of Marjorie Kempe, which relates her non-secular adventure from spouse and mom in Bishop's Lynn, England, to a chaste Christian, visionary and popular, if controversial, public speaker. Kempe turned into illiterate and dictated her lifestyle first to her son, after which to a priest, as she statistic in her book, and it states an almost as useful research on Christian spirituality and lifestyles within the Middle Age. The next period is Renaissance and Reformation period. Timeline of the era. The Renaissance was a fervent period of European cultural, artistic, political, and economic. Renaissance after the Middle Age, generally described as occurring from the 14th to the 17th century. Renaissance fostered the rediscovery of classical philosophy, literature, and art. Some of the greatest thinkers, authors, statesmen, scientists, and artists in human history flourished during this time, as global exploration opened up new lands and cultures to European trade. The Renaissance is credited with the bridging the gap between the Middle Age and modern civilization. Next is characteristics of this era. Characteristics of the Renaissance include a renewed interest in classical antiquity, an increase in humanist philosophy, self-belief, human worth, and individual dignity, and radical change in ideas about religion, politics, and science. The people of the Renaissance had common values. This includes humanism, individualism, skepticism, completeness, secularism, and classicism. These values were reflected in buildings, writings, paintings, sculpture, and sciences. The next is the major author and works of the era. First is William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare was the greatest writer of the time, born in 564. He was an actor and the writer for his plays. He also wrote the Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, Midsummer Night's Dream, Twelfth Night, and Henry V. Next is Miguel De Cervantes. Miguel was an influential Spanish Renaissance writer. He wrote many plays and works of fiction, including novelas ejemplares in 1613. His plays was not widely known until the publication of his most influential work, Don Quixote of La Mancha. Next is Nicola Machiavelli. Machiavelli was a diplomat in Florence who tried to answer the question of how a ruler could guarantee he would stay in power by raising the prince in 1513. The next is Revolution and Restoration period. Timeline of the era. In 642, Parliament shuts down the theatres in England. In 660, restoration of Charles II monarchy is restored in English. It's officially the beginning of the Restoration period. And also in this year, Charles II reopens the theatres. In the next 7 years, John Milton wrote his epic religious poem while he was going blind. The title is Paradise Lost. In 672, John Ryden published Mariage à la mode. In the 675, William Wycherley published The Country Wife. In the 677, Abra Brand published The Rover. In the 678, John Bunyan published Pilgrim's Progress. In the 682, John Ryden published Flecknoe. In the 700, William Congreve published The Way of the World. This famous comedy of manners marks the end of the Restoration period in literary history. So the next is characteristics of the era. First is social and political conflict. With the comeback of Charles II, England's social, political, and religious tenets have transformed. The two devastating incidents, the Great Plague of London and the Great Fire of London, did much more harm to English social life. V.G. Long said, "To the king and court and high society of this period arose or died disgust or pity. The private life of England remained honest and pure even in the worst days of the Restoration." The next is opening of theatres. All the institutions that were closed in the Puritanical movement were opened during the Restoration period. Political monarchy, parliament, episcopacy, and law were all restored. The clubs and coffee houses were also established during the period. These houses become the centers of political discussions, and from here only, the periodical essays were originated. Next is rise of Neoclassicism. The Restoration marks a complete break with the past, and the Elizabethan Romanticism was almost over. With the end of the past, literature took a new spirit and outlook, a different attitude in the subject and style. The next is imitation of the ancients. The authors of the periods were not endowed with exceptional talents, so they turned to the ancient writers for guidance and inspiration. They directed their attention to the slavish imitation of rules and ignored the importance of the subject matter. This habit was noticeable in the age of Ryden, and it was strengthened in the age of Pope. Okay, so the next is the major authors and works of the era. There are several major authors and works of this era. William Congreve, he was the greatest writer of the Restoration period. His works are Love for Love and The Way of the World. Next is John Ryden. He was known as a playwright, critic, and satirist. His works include The Conquest of Granada, The Indian Queen, and Aurangzebe. Next is Thomas Hobbes. He was a naturalist who stated that natural science should be the foundation of all human knowledge. His ideas are expressed in the book The Leviathan. And the last is the 18th century period, the timeline of the era. European nations competed amongst themselves for global domination in exploration, trade, and colonization, with Great Britain becoming the leading world power. Even as these nations expanded their reach, they found their rule challenged by supporters of Enlightenment ideas based on the ideals of liberty, progress, and the separation of church and state. The American Revolution from 775 till 783, and the French Revolution 789 till 799, and the Haitian Revolution 791 till 804 would be the most successful of these uprisings, which shook the power of European monarchies. The Industrial Revolution that began in mid-18th century resulted in the transition of Europe from agriculture to manufacturing and its population from rural to urban. And one important rival to European domination was the Ottoman Empire. The Durrani dynasty, founded in present-day Afghanistan, would become the second largest Muslim empire in the world, following military victories in Russia and India starting in 747. Characteristics of the era. Characteristics of the period include observing human nature and nature itself, which were considered unchanging and constant. The age is also known as the Neoclassical period. Writers of the time placed great emphasis of the original writings produced by classical Greek and Roman literature. Next is the major authors and works of the era. There are several major authors and works in this era of this era. First, Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope was the predominant figure in the poetry of the 18th century. His major works are an essay on criticism, The Temple of Fame, A Vision, Eloisa to Abera. Next is Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift was an Irish author and satirist. His major works are Gulliver's Travels, A Tale of a Top Modest Proposal. That's all from me. Thank you.